In this video, I'm looking at the topic of reproductive hormones. So this is reproductive system unit, and it's to do with assignment 1, task 2. So if you go onto reproductive unit on VLE and scroll down, you will get to this section called reproductive hormones. And I've specifically decided to include this video because I think the topic of reproductive hormones is a little bit more technical, whereas the structure and function of reproductive system is something you could potentially look at and research fairly easily. So the PowerPoint I'm using is found right there. It's called estrous cycle, which is just a different term for menstrual cycle. And so we're looking at the hormones which are responsible for controlling your menstrual cycle. So this is what this PowerPoint looks like. So I'm going to start it. I'm not going to read out kind of everything which is written on the slides. Obviously, you can read that information yourselves. So if you want to kind of have time to read, then just pause the video, read information, and then restart the video again. So let me start the slideshow for you. It would be helpful if before watching this video you went and had a look at the structure and function of female reproductive system, because I think it'll make things a lot easier for you in terms of being able to follow this explanation. So make sure you do that before you start this particular video. So as I said, I'm not going to read all of this information. You can read it yourselves. But the bottom line is that females have this estrous cycle or menstrual cycle, and it occurs every month roughly, and it's to do with hormonal changes in a female. And the menstrual cycle is responsible for making sure that your lining and your eggs are released kind of at the right point in time, and the lining is maintained in the best possible shape. So just to kind of recap some of the key points about the structure of a female reproductive system, here is a sort of simplified image of the female reproductive system, and I'm hoping you would be able to name most of the organs on this diagram. So have a go before we proceed, so you can pause the video and name the organs, as many as you can, and then restart the video again. So the kind of the brown blobs on either side are ovaries. You have two of those, and they are the organs which store and release eggs and let those eggs to be matured. Just as a side note, ovaries do not produce eggs, unlike, say, testes in a male, which constantly produce sperm. Ovaries are only used as a kind of storage and place of maturation, but not where eggs originate from. So all the eggs in a female are produced originally when they're still about 8 or 9 week embryo inside their mom's tummy, and at that point they are produced in a place called egg sac. So they subsequently migrate into ovaries, and that's where they're stored and then released over a period of time. So once eggs are released from the ovary, they start traveling into this tube called fallopian tube. That bit is called fimbria, by the way, this kind of fringy bit, and this just provides kind of connection, if you like, between the pathway for the egg to start traveling into fallopian tube. So that egg is going to traveling from fallopian tube. By the way, fertilization should occur inside fallopian tube, so fertilization doesn't occur in the uterus. It occurs somewhere at this point. And so the egg will keep on traveling into the uterus. So that's the cavity of the uterus where there is a potential for the embryo to start growing. So further down, you've got cervix, which is sort of entrance into the uterus, and then obviously you've got vagina further down. So the walls of uterus are very thick, and they have a lot of smooth muscle. So you should, uh, be aware by now that smooth muscle is, not something you can control consciously. So this is outside your conscious control, and this is, I hope again you remember this little fact, this is actually the largest mass of smooth muscle in a female body, so it's all found in the uterus. And the reason for the presence of this smooth muscle is so you can stretch fairly easily to accommodate the growing embryo, but even more importantly, you need all this muscle to be able to push this massive baby through a tiny little opening of cervix and vagina at the point of birth. So that's why you need incredibly strong muscle to be able to do it. Even with all this muscle, it's still a really tricky job, as some of you would be able to testify. So then the lining of the uterus, that sort of kind of squiggly, if you like, line, this is called endometrium. And this is the part which gets shed every month and then rebuilt. And the reason why it gets kind of renewed every month is because your body in a female is kind of gearing up every month to the prospect that there might be pregnancy coming, and so the endometrium needs to be in the best possible condition for this potential pregnancy. So if pregnancy does not occur in that particular month, then endometrium is discarded, and the new endometrium is built again in anticipation that there might be pregnancy in the following month. And so your body is constantly kind of going through this cycle, gearing up for potential pregnancy to make sure that endometrium is kind of fit for purpose, if you like. It's in the best possible shape for that potential pregnancy. Okay, so if we now take an ovary specifically and we take a tiny slice of tissue and then stick it under the microscope, this is what we would be able to see. So this is not a cartoon image like the previous diagram. This is what you can actually see under the microscope. So this is your actual tissue taken from an ovary. So here is the edge of the ovary, right? And then fairly close to the edge, and don't forget this is like magnified probably, I don't know, 500 times, maybe even more. So this is strong magnification. So fairly close to the edge of the ovary, you have these little balls, if you like, little structures called follicles. And follicles, you can imagine them being like kind of a ball, if you like, filled with fluid. So what you have here in white is fluid, and then suspended in this fluid, and you can see it here, the pink circle, is the egg, developing egg, or so-called oocyte, if you want to use technical term. So this is what this label is telling you. Now, the follicles which are on the early stages of development, they're called primordial, or sometimes also known as primary follicles. And these are the follicles you're born with, right? So this is before they start developing. So they're really, very small. And depending on which sources of information you look at, the number of follicles at birth is going to vary from source to source. And I suppose it varies from person to person. But some of the common numbers are quoting between 300 and 400,000 of these primordial follicles at birth. As you're getting older, some of these follicles will develop and get released, and so the number is going to diminish this way. But even beyond that, the number will diminish with age, because those follicles, they will start disintegrate the older you are. And so if we take a woman maybe in mid 40s or early 40s, we're probably talking about maybe several thousands of these follicles still available, but certainly not, hundreds, thousands at that point. So that's why, I'm not saying let's all go out and get pregnant immediately, but just be mindful that, in a female, the number of follicles is going to diminish with age. That's why I think, um, with the fact that a lot of women are now waiting a bit longer to have families, that's why a lot of sort of issues with um, fertility and therefore availability of, say, IVF is on the rise as a result. So just be aware of that. So as these follicles develop every month, and obviously this development only going to start happening once a girl hits puberty. So before that, these primordial follicles are simply sitting in the ovaries and not really doing much. But every month in a female beyond kind of puberty and before the follicles stop getting released altogether, which is happens probably when you're, I don't know, 50 or thereabouts. Depends, also varies from female to another female. So, but in a childbearing age, those follicles will develop. So you can see here on this micrograph that there are a couple of follicles here which are bigger. Their walls are thicker. And these walls, those cells within the walls of these developing follicles, they are the cells which produce hormone called estrogen. So those follicles are called secondary follicles, and they still contain oocyte or eggs inside them. And as I said, as they're developing, those secondary follicles will start producing more and more estrogen. So on the next diagram, you have this kind of even more developed secondary follicle. You can see the walls of that follicle is really thick, lots of cells here, and all of these cells are churning out estrogen. So with development of secondary follicles, the estrogen levels will start to get higher. Now, at one point, one of those secondary follicles is going to develop even further into this big, massive structure. Well, don't forget, this is all microscopic size, so everything is relative, but compared to sizes of primary follicles, this is really big. And this one dominant follicle is called Graafian follicle with a capital G, named after a scientist called De Graaf, who was Dutch, nationality. And so this follicle is named after this scientist, after De Graaf. He wasn't the first person to kind of who came across Graafian follicle, but he was the first person to kind of describe the development of follicles during the cycle. He actually did it on rabbits, though, not on humans. And another fun fact for you, De Graaf is also credited with first discovering, if you like, G-spot, discovering inverted commas again. Even though G-spot now, some of the information about that has sort of been discredited, and there are sources which say it's a lot of nonsense, the G-spot, but there you go. Anyway. So that's the graph for you. So this is a Graafian follicle. This is how you spell it. So what happens is, as primary follicles develop into secondary follicles, they migrated closer to the center of the ovary. But when Graafian follicle is kind of getting more and more mature, it starts traveling again closer to the edge of the ovary. You can see edges here. So as it's traveling closer to the edge, essentially it's gearing up to ovulation. So at some point, that edge of a Graafian follicle and the edge of the ovary are going to fuse together, and this fluid inside Graafian follicle is going to kind of whoosh out, and as it's coming out, it's going to also take with it the oocyte, which is ready for ovulation, ready to be released. So this oocyte is going to get released, is going to start traveling through fallopian tube, and potentially will get fertilized inside the fallopian tube. So this point in time when Graafian follicle ruptures and releases oocyte, this is what we call ovulation. Okay, so the next slide. So what happens next? Well, next, that ruptured Graafian follicle is going to turn into the next structure, and this structure is called corpus luteum. And this structure is again really important because it produces a hormone called progesterone, right? So before Graafian follicle released its oocyte and turned into corpus luteum, not much progesterone would be in this woman's system. But as soon as ovulation occurred and this corpus luteum came about, then the amount of progesterone is going to start increasing. Now, corpus luteum comes from Latin. Corpus means body, luteum means yellow. It's not obvious from this micrograph, but if you're dissecting an ovary, the Graafian follicle kind of stands out a little bit because it's got sort of yellowish tinge to it. It's not bright yellow. I mean, some books show you diagrams which color corpus luteum in this kind of neon yellow almost. Obviously, it's not going to be quite like that, but it's got that yellowish tinge, and that's where the name corpus luteum came from. So as I mentioned before, it produces a lot of progesterone, also produces some estrogen as well, and so that's another hormone really important for menstrual cycle. The reason being that progesterone helps to maintain the endometrium. So it thickens endometrium and makes sure that it's in this perfect condition for potential implantation of a fertilized egg in the beginning of a pregnancy. So at this point, you've got two potential scenarios, right? So if pregnancy did occur, then corpus luteum is going to be maintained in the ovary. It's not going to be maintained throughout pregnancy. At one point, other structures were going to start producing progesterone. But it definitely gets maintained at the start of a pregnancy. And so the amount of progesterone is going to be fairly high. And this is what's going to ensure that the endometrium is not lost, and therefore the pregnancy is not lost. However, if pregnancy did not occur, then corpus luteum is going to start to disintegrate, and the amount of progesterone is going to get smaller and smaller, and that's what's going to lead to endometrium disintegrating, and then the whole cycle would start again. So here we've got a diagram which shows you kind of the thickness of endometrium. So it's a very kind of simplified diagram, obviously. And this shows you how the thickness of endometrium changes throughout your cycle. So this picture kind of covers one whole cycle. And then, so this line corresponds to that line at the end of the cycle, and then the whole thing would be repeated again and again, like a series. So what I'd like you to do at this point is pause the video in a minute and try to answer a couple of questions. So where do you think on this diagram would be the start of the period? So which point on this diagram would represent start of your period? And which point in the diagram do you think represents the end of the period? Okay, so start of a period, end of a period. And the third question, which kind of window, so not really point, but sort of a section, if you like, of a diagram, represents the time where you would want fertilized egg to land on endometrium? So where do you think would be kind of the best time for the egg to potentially start the pregnancy and get implanted into the endometrium? So these are my three questions. So pause the video now, have a go at kind of thinking about it carefully and see what you can come up with. Okay, so I had several questions for you. So the first one I was asking is, where do you think the start of the period would be? And the start of the period would be round about here. So, well, how do I know? Well, because you remember the line represents the thickness of endometrium, so at this point it's pretty thick, but here it's pretty thin. And here I can see clearly that that line, the thickness of endometrium, is starting to go down. So the reason why it's starting to go down, because you're going to start losing chunks of this endometrium during period. So I know as soon as it starts to kind of slide down, that's the beginning of a period. So it's about, well, I'd say about there, right? And my second question was, when is the end of a period? Well, if I go to this end of the graph, I can see that that line is still going down. So it means I'm still losing endometrium. But at this point, I'm going to stop losing endometrium, and that's the end of a period. So it means from that point on, it starts to build up again, starts to increase. So beginning of a period about there, the end of a period, pretty much that point. And then the best time for the egg to get implanted is going to be around about kind of that area. Why is that? Because this is the time when I've got most of, you can see the endometrium is fake, right, throughout this time. But here is the point where I also have a lot of kind of folds and a lot of blood vessels which are supplying my endometrium, so it's going to be about there. And the next kind of series of labels are going to help you to explain it further. So this is the period when it's still being shed. Then you've got estrogen starting to repair endometrium. Sorry, the wrong button. So progesterone at this point thickens endometrium and makes sure it's in best possible condition. And it also kind of stimulates a lot of new blood vessels to be formed, and they're called spiral arteries. So if you imagine the fertilized egg is going to land on this endometrium, what you want is a very rich blood supply. So you have supply of building materials to start to help this fertilized egg to grow into an embryo and further into fetus. So all of those supplies need to be brought by blood vessels. So those arteries are going to be really important. Okay, so if, as I said before, if fertilization didn't occur and pregnancy didn't occur, then the amount of progesterone is going to start dropping, and that would cause those spiral arteries to constrict and reduce amount of blood which arrives into endometrium, and endometrium will just start dying off, and that's what causes the period. All right, so in terms of the hormones, there are 4 main hormones which are responsible for controlling menstrual cycle. Now, the first hormone is called FSH, and these 3 letters stand for follicle stimulating hormone. And before I go any further, let me just remind you a few basic facts about hormones, which you should be aware of. So you remember, hormones are chemical messengers. They are produced by glands, and those glands are found throughout your body. And once a gland produced those hormones, the hormones are released into your bloodstream, and they start traveling throughout your body, so they can reach potentially every single cell, every single bit of tissue everywhere in your body. And the trick of kind of minimizing or restricting how many cells and how many tissues that hormone is going to affect is by using lock and key principle. You remember that, right? So you have receptors on surfaces of your cells, and only hormones which are complementary shape to those receptors, they're the ones which are going to affect that particular cell. So all the other cells are going to just ignore the message of that hormone. So this is just a quick recap. So my follicle stimulating hormone is actually produced all the way in the gland called pituitary gland. So, and as a reminder, pituitary gland is found in your brain, so it's nowhere close to your reproductive system. But because hormones travel through blood and can reach, other part of your body, so that's how FSH is going to reach your reproductive organs. So let's think about the name of this hormone. So it's called follicle stimulating hormone. And kind of the explanation of what it does really is in the name. So the structures which will have receptors, correct receptors for FSH, are located in the follicles in your ovaries. All the other cells in your body are going to pretty much ignore the messages from FSH. And what it does, and the message FSH gives follicles, is to start developing, right? That hence follicle stimulating hormone. So basically, it's going to tell primary follicles to start turning into secondary follicles and further into Graafian follicle, at least for one of them, right? So that's what it does. The second hormone is called LH, and this stands for luteinizing hormone. And again, you can see it's produced by pituitary gland, so same thing as before. It's going to get released into your bloodstream. It's going to go throughout your body, but there are only certain structures which are going to respond to this hormone. So which structures respond to the hormone? Well, luteinizing, again, that gives you a clue. So you remember we talked about corpus luteum, right? Which was that structure Graafian follicle turns into the yellow body. So essentially, the job of LH is to tell Graafian follicle to turn into corpus luteum. And as it's turning into corpus luteum, what Graafian follicle has to do, it's got to burst through the edge of the ovary and release the egg. So essentially, what LH is doing, in other words, it's producing ovulation, right? So it's stimulating for ovulation to happen. So the next two hormones are the ones which you probably heard of. They're called estrogen, and I mentioned that before, that it's the walls of developing follicles, those sort of multiple layers of cells surrounding follicles. They're the ones which produce estrogen. By the way, just a little kind of side note about spelling. So on the PowerPoint here, you can see estrogen spelled with OE. This is British spelling, but you will come across websites where O is dropped and estrogen is spelled just with E, S, T, etc. And this is American spelling. So same word essentially. It's not a different hormone. It's just spelling is different in American English and British English. And the last hormone is progesterone. So progesterone, again as a reminder, is produced by that yellow body, corpus luteum, in the ovary. And so as corpus luteum is developing, the levels of progesterone are going to be higher. So next is going to be this diagram. So from first glance, it looks pretty complicated, but let's try to kind of tackle it together. So my levels of FSH and LH is going to be in this top diagram, and then estrogen and progesterone are going to be in the second set of axes. Now, the reason why they often separate those diagrams, those sort of graphs rather, out into two is because if you try to draw 4 lines on a single diagram, it sort of makes it a bit more tricky to make sense. But you can come across diagrams where all 4 lines are on the same set of axes. So it's up to you. You can choose to use those if you prefer. Now, my second question, I suppose, would be, why do you think they decided to group FSH and LH together on one graph and then put estrogen and progesterone on a different graph? Why not say put FSH and estrogen on one and LH and progesterone on a different one? So, well, if you were kind of following the logic from the previous slide, I'm hoping you'll be able to answer that. So the reason why we decided to do it that way is because FSH and LH are produced by pituitary glands. So somebody looking at it said, well, it might as well, put them together, group them together. And then estrogen and progesterone are produced by structures found within ovaries predominantly, right? So that's why we kind of decided to do it that way. So if I now show you these lines to represent how these levels of hormones change throughout the cycle. So here are your 4 lines. So just to kind of sort of say maybe slightly obvious things, but I'd rather say it. So if you're looking at a line on a graph, if that line is creeping up, that means that the level of this hormone is going up, so the concentration is going up. If the line is going down, it means the concentration is getting smaller, so there's less of that hormone in the system. And if the line is just parallel, it means that the amount of hormone does not change. So just to point that out. So those lines tell you essentially a story about how these 4 hormones contribute to controlling your menstrual cycle. So let me kind of talk you through this story. So the story starts with your pituitary gland. It starts with pituitary gland producing a higher amount of FSH. So you can see that little peak there. So that's the pituitary gland starting to produce FSH. So that FSH is going to go into your bloodstream, is going to reach your ovaries, as well as all the other organs, by the way, in your body, right? But the follicles in your ovaries are the ones which have got the right receptor for this hormone. And so they receive this message and they respond to the message by starting to develop. You remember, follicle stimulating hormone. And as they are developing, the walls of these follicles are going to start to get thicker, so they're going to turn into secondary follicles. And those walls are going to start producing estrogen. And that's why that line is starting to creep up. So as follicles are developing, more and more estrogen is going to start coursing through your bloodstream. And so that level is going up and up and up and up. And at one point, it's going to reach maximum amount. It's going to reach the peak. And because that estrogen is going through your bloodstream, so it's everywhere in your body, your pituitary gland can read from that level and respond to it. And so when estrogen levels are maximum, your pituitary gland is going to respond by producing a large peak of luteinizing hormone or LH, and that's where that blue dotted line comes in. So your estrogen level is signaling to pituitary gland, hey, it's time to start producing a lot of LH, and that's what your pituitary gland does. So it produces big peak of LH and also a smaller peak of FSH. And what those do, they also go into your bloodstream. And you remember, luteinizing hormone is going to essentially tell Graafian follicle, hey, it's time to turn into corpus luteum, right? Luteinize, turn into corpus luteum. And so therefore, Graafian follicle is going to respond by coming close to the edge of the ovary and releasing the egg. And that point in time we call ovulation. So that's why that happens. As soon as Graafian follicle released the egg, the oocyte, you remember, starts to turn into this structure called corpus luteum, yellow body, remember? So that's where I was saying, sometimes on pictures they show it as bright yellow, even though in reality it's not quite as bright, but it references that yellow color. So corpus luteum is going to start producing progesterone. So you see, at that point, that's the point in time where progesterone levels start to creep up. And this is all to do with corpus luteum being in the picture, being inside your ovaries and producing this hormone. So before that, before ovulation happened, progesterone levels were very, very low. But as soon as corpus luteum is in the picture, then progesterone level starts to go up. Now, here is where I was talking about two potential scenarios, right? Because if you did get pregnant, right, then in that scenario, corpus luteum is going to be maintained and the progesterone levels are going to be maintained. So the graph would just be, green dotted line, just going along that sort of line as a parallel. So the levels of progesterone would be higher, and that's what would maintain the lining, right? So that's what makes sure that you don't shed the lining and you don't lose that potential pregnancy. If you didn't get pregnant, however, then corpus luteum is going to start to shrivel up. You can see it's getting smaller and smaller, and ultimately it's going to disappear altogether. And so the progesterone levels are going to go down. And as they're going down, then the lining will stop being maintained, and so at one point, it triggers sort of lining to be lost because of constriction of all these spiral arteries in the endometrium. So that's basically what the kind of the story is of what's happening on these diagrams. On the next slide, I'm not going to read it all out again to you. You can just pause and look through this information in your own time. It basically talks you through all the main sort of stages of menstrual cycle. Okay? So pause now, read through this information, and then come back to the video. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. So my advice would be, if you are completing this assignment, instead of just looking at this explanation and kind of trying to reword one sentence at a time, because that's going to lead to high similarity, my advice would be to move to the next slide, where you just have the diagrams showing you levels of the 4 hormones, and sort of try to recreate your own explanation, right? So just look at the diagrams and think, well, this happens, and therefore what happens as a result, and kind of try to write this narrative of explaining how these hormones trigger those different processes. And so essentially the whole thing becomes like a chain of events. So your story needs to start with FSH, so that's going to be your first kind of beginning of a whole explanation, with the fact that pituitary gland will produce this peak of FSH at the beginning of the cycle. And from there you can kind of think logically, well, FSH, I can remember that it's follicle stimulating hormone, therefore it's going to do X, Y, Z, and therefore that's going to happen, and therefore that next thing is going to happen. So have a go at that, and then kind of you can always go back and kind of recheck whether you got most of the explanation correct. But this gives you a way of explaining it in your own way, and kind of phrasing information in a way which makes sense to you. Okay, so that's basically the second task of assignment 2. There are other additional questions to do with hormones, to do with lactation and labor, but I usually ask people to research those kind of themselves, just leave it as a bit of an independent research. Usually I'm not asking for a lot of information on those lactation hormones and labor hormones. Just a few sentences will be enough just to show me that you've done a bit of your own research. And so there's one more slide there. And again, I'm not going to read through that information. I'll just leave you to read through it yourselves. But this basically summarizes a little bit of an overview of the female reproductive system, but more importantly, the process of menstrual cycle and how the 4 main hormones contribute to controlling this menstrual cycle. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.